talk a little bit about vision and the eyeball. So you've already heard about, the sense organs and things like that, but we had bypassed the eye because it's kind of has a lot to it and it's very important. So we're going to talk about the eyeball itself as well as the special sense of vision. So the eye components, the function is to help form an accurate image. So don't get it twisted that the function is to detect an image, because it's not just looking around for things. That's not how it works. It is going to utilize light. It's going to utilize photoreceptors that are actually in the eye to send an impulse to the brain. Just like we talked about with sense organs, that it's actually the brain that perceives what we're seeing as an image based on that electromagnetic sense that's coming through by light. So eye components function is to help form an accurate visual image. It does not detect an image like a video camera or something. So photoreceptors are really important for vision. They are located in a single layer of cells. So that way, if they're being stimulated, it's only one layer. It doesn't have to get like deep or superficial or anything like that. And those are located in the retina, which we'll go over on a different part. The retina is the structure that lines the back of the eyeball, and its function is to detect an image and generate those visual nerve impulses to send to the brain. You know how anatomy and physiology loves to split things into layers. So the eyeball itself can be broken up into different groups or layers. You have the outer fibrous layer, which includes the cornea and the sclera. The middle vascular layer, which covers the choroid, iris, ciliary body. And then the inner sensory layer, which is also called the nervous layer, which includes the retina. So there's a good image for kind of being able to label parts of the eyeball. So I think that's a pretty important image for you to study. So starting with that outer fibrous layer, it includes that cornea and the sclera. So the cornea is transparent. It is the part of the eye, when you get real close, that covers the colored part and the pupil of the eye. So it is transparent, that way it can let the light through for visual image recognition. It lets that light through to get to the back. It's an orderly arrangement of collagen fibers. That's what gives it that fibrous texture or that fibrous layer. And it actually has no blood vessels at all. But we've talked about before that blood is needed, right, for nourishment, oxygen receiving, that type of thing for any body part. There are no blood vessels. So the fun fact about the cornea is that it actually utilizes oxygen directly from the air. It has many, many pain receptors. If anybody has ever poked their eye, got an eyelash in their eye, God forbid, scratched their eye, it hurts so bad because it's such a sensitive area. And we talked about with pain that is the body's way of protecting itself, so that if something is going to hurt, their animal is going to avoid it to keep that vision safer. Inflammation, the term for that is keratitis. That's inflammation of the cornea. There's a lot of definitions in this one, so make sure you're jotting those down. The sclera is the white of the eye. See the white of my eyeball? So the outer layer around the eyeball that is white is called the sclera. It is also made up of fibrous tissue, essentially, that helps get the structure of the eye itself and keep it strong and in that circular circular shape. The term limbus, L-I-M-B-U-S, is the junction of the cornea and the sclera. So let me cover that again. So two components of the outer fibrous layer, the cornea and the sclera. That limbus is just the junction where those two come together. And that cornea gives some structure and shape to the eyeball, but is one of the most sensitive structures of the body. Yikes. So a corneal ulcer, by definition, is a disruption of the tissue of the cornea. So you can see these images here. Some you can even see, like that bottom one, you can see that there's some type of disruption for sure. There is a test for this. Do you remember what that test is called? Yell it out if you know it. If you guessed fluorescein stain, you are correct. So a fluorescein stain is when we put the fluorescein dye into the eye and rinse it, and then any disruption of those collagen fibers, that dye will stick to it. And then when we look at it, either with the naked eye sometimes, but with a UV or a black light, you'll see that fluoresce or light up this bright green to determine where that is. And a corneal ulcer can be superficial, where just a few pieces or collagen fibers are angry or irritated or abrased, or it can be really deep to the point that it can actually break through. Yikes. Now we're on the middle or the vascular layer of the eye, which is also called the uvea. In this layer is the choroid, which lies between the sclera, which is the white of the eye, and the retina. So remember, we're kind of talking the back of the eye because the retina is the structure that lines the back of the eye. So that sclera is the white, so the back of the eyeball. So in between that is the choroid. It consists mainly of pigment, which is why it is very dark colored black back there, as well as blood vessels, which makes sense since it's called the vascular layer of the eye. So the tapetum lucidum, which is a super fun word to say, is a highly reflective area in the rear of the eye and most domestic animals. However, pigs, swine, don't have a tapetum lucidum. The point of the tapetum lucidum is actually to be extra reflective, to bounce that light through the eye and back again a second time. And that's going to help with night vision. So that's why us humans, we can't see very well in the night. We do not have a tapetum lucidum. So the same thing for pigs. I wanted to mention also, which I didn't before, with that blood vessels, it kind of goes without saying, but those blood vessels being the vascular layer, that is where the blood supply to the retina come from. So there's always a nice blood supply of nutrients, oxygen, all kinds of good molecules that go through there to keep it healthy and nourished. So that next one there you see is the ciliary body. The ciliary body is a ring-shaped structure that is directly behind the iris. Let me jump down one, and we've got iris. So the iris is kind of what you would consider that colored part of your eye, but by definition, it is a pigmented muscular diaphragm. So a muscular diaphragm is that it's a muscle and it can open and close. Okay, so the diaphragm is that muscle. It's a smooth muscle. It is pigmented, therefore we get that color of the eye, and its job is to control the amount of light that enters into the posterior part of the eye. That opening is called a pupil. So remember that the pupil is not a thing. It is essentially the center of the iris. It is a hole that lets light in between that muscular diaphragm, but it's not like a physical item. It's the opening or the hole is called the pupil. So recap, middle vascular layer, also called the uvea. Choroid is going to supply the blood supply to the retina. It's very vascular as well as pigmented to make it dark to absorb light. The tapetum lucidum is a highly reflective surface or area, but it's still part of the choroid or that vascular layer. Humans and pigs do not have a tapetum lucidum. And if you can't picture what I'm talking about, if you've ever driven up north in the dark and you're going camping or going somewhere up there and you're driving in the night and deer or elk are on the side of the road, even with other animals, cats, dogs, etc. When you shine your headlights onto them, you get that blinding bright light reflection. You're actually seeing the reflection of that tapetum lucidum of their eye. Ciliary body, ring-shaped structure behind the iris. So back up to that one. So we talked about what the iris was, but that ciliary body contains tiny muscles that control the shape of the lens. So we have our little circle like this with these little fingers of muscles that are able to pull that lens to adjust for near and far vision. That's part of the middle vascular layer of the eye. And then once again, the iris is that pigmented muscular diaphragm, accounts for the color of our eye that you see, and controls the amount of light by way of opening and closing that pupil. Here's a good image for you so you can see that middle vascular layer. So I am going to hover my mouse over here where you see uvea, so you can see the choroid that lines the back of the eyeball between the sclera and the retina. You can see that ciliary body that's up against that has these finger-like muscles that are attached to the lens. And then the iris, which is that pigmented diaphragm that is the color of the eye with the hole that goes through to the lens called the pupil. Inflammation of the uvea, or the middle layer of the eye, is called uveitis, inflammation of the uvea. You can see some good pictures here. So it's showing an anterior chamber uveitis where inflammatory cells and proteins are filling it up. That fluid that fills that space of the eye is between the iris and the corneal endothelium, or the cornea itself. So it kind of gives it this bubble-like and opaque appearance. Now we're into the inner layer of the eyeball, the most inner layer, also called the nervous layer. And it's because it's full of nervous tissue. That's where the actual nerve, nerve impulses or electrical impulses that are sent through the optic nerve to the brain. So that is your retina. So it lines the very back of the eye, one component of what's called the fundus. So the fundus is the retina as well as the optic disc. And you can see on that picture there that the optic disc, which is also called the blind spot, is that small dot in the back of the eye that goes from the inside of the eye to the optic nerve of the brain that goes to the brain. The retina contains rods and cones. Rods and cones are our functional unit of the vision system, essentially, the sensory receptors for vision. So rods and cones are what the name is for those photoreceptors. You can see on the picture over here that says pathway of light, that the pathway goes in, obviously through the cornea that's transparent. It's going to go through the hole of that is the pupil that the iris has opened or closed to let a specific amount of light in through the lens. And then that's going to go through that larger component to hit the back of the eye where the retina lies with those photoreceptors, and those rods and cones are going to be able to read that information of the light and send those impulses down the way. Now I'm back to the posterior aspect of the eyeball in this other picture here. There's that optic disc, which is the blind spot because there are no photoreceptors there at all. And it's also showing the central artery and the vein of the retina because we have to have lots of oxygen and nutrition. When we get to nervous system, we'll talk a lot about how the nervous system uses tons and tons of oxygen to be able to keep nerve cells alive and keep things going. So water and oxygen are obviously two really important components of what we need for life. The picture also shows that neural layer of the retina, and it's got a pigmented part so that it's dark, so that it brings in light and absorbs it. The choroid back there, which is that vascular layer, and then this lighter color is the sclera. So it's showing because you have a white of your eye all around, but it's on the back too. So you can't forget that it's not just like a cover, it's a whole eyeball. Looking at my notes here. Actually, I covered all that. I got a note for the next page to talk to you guys about. So we have those layers of the eyeballs that we've gone over the different components of, but now we can also split the eyeball into different compartments. So you can see the line here that splits the eyeball to the anterior segment and the posterior segment. So anterior, the front portion, and the posterior, which is the back portion. So the posterior segment, or the back, is called the vitreous compartment, and it contains vitreous humor. So if you're jotting down words and definitions, the term humor doesn't mean like ha ha ha, although it is still funny to say, but humor means fluid. So the vitreous body, okay, so body meaning compartment or area of the vitreous compartment, has vitreous humor or vitreous fluid that's in it. The anterior segment holds the anterior chamber, and that chamber contains aqueous humor. So the anterior chamber, the aqueous compartment, is the only portion of the interior eye that we can actually see clearly without an ophthalmoscope. So that's kind of a good thing to know and be able to explain to owners why we're doing these visual exams with the ophthalmoscope. We're not just able to look in there and see the back of the eye. We can really only see right into there to the iris, to the pupil, maybe even a little portion of the lens, especially if there's something wrong with it. But we can't see all the way to the other components that we need to be able to see. So aqueous compartment in the anterior segment has aqueous humor, and those are the two main components of the eye. So that aqueous compartment, which is located in front of the lens, you can see the lens, I like to call the lens the sucked on skittle. When we dissect the eyeball, you're going to understand why I say that, but it literally is like the shape of a skittle. It has this kind of fibrous texture. And if you've ever sucked on a skittle and it loses its color and kind of gets extra squishy, that's what it looks like. So if you look at the sucked on skittle, that white lens that you see in the picture right there, behind or posterior to it is the posterior segment, which is the vitreous body. The anterior segment, which the lens is actually in the anterior segment, is the anterior chamber containing that aqueous humor. So the aqueous compartment in front of the lens, which is subdivided by the iris. So the aqueous compartment or the chamber is, you can see that it has the iris as well as the pupil, since that's the hole, and that's kind of an additional space there. So it contains a clear, the fluids are two very different textures, which you'll see when we do dissection as well. But aqueous, think Aquaman, fluid like the sea. It's a very thin, watery substance that's called that aqueous fluid or aqueous humor. That vitreous compartment in the posterior segment contains a clear, thick, kind of gelatinous fluid. That's the vitreous humor. So it literally is pretty squishy and gross, kind of looks like a clear loogie. Sorry, not sorry. And that fills that entire posterior segment and kind of gives it some additional pressure back there. See if I have any other notes. Nope, I covered it all. So let me know if you have any questions about that. So that thin fluid of aqueous humor, how is it produced? The aqueous humor gets produced in the posterior chamber by cells of the ciliary body. So remember, the ciliary body is that muscle attachment through the choroid that has those finger-like muscles. You can see like little strings in that picture that hold on to the lens. So the ciliary body, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but it's that thicker red maroon muscly color. It's labeled ciliary body. And you can see where those strings of muscles that attach to the lens are directly underneath it. And that first yellow arrow, I'm pointing to it, I don't know if you can tell, that yellow arrow, so it's produced there in the ciliary body, and then it comes out, but it flows to the front portion of the eye directly in front of that little area in front of the lens. Then it comes around the iris and actually in the front through the pupil, which is a hole, remember, and then it is in that front chamber. So it's constantly being made by the ciliary body, constantly flowing forward into that anterior chamber, but then it's drained by the canal of Schlemm. I like to make everybody say canal of Schlemm because it sounds gross and you'll remember it that way. So that's where that aqueous fluid gets drained. So it comes through the pupil, fills the anterior chamber, constantly drained by the canal of Schlemm, and that actually drains into the bloodstream. So you can see that it's going up into these vessels up here and out. And so new and out, new and out. So made by the ciliary body cells, flows to the front chamber by way of the pupil, and is drained constantly from the anterior chamber by that canal of, you want to say it, Schlemm, into the bloodstream. All right, so now we're talking about the sucked on skittle, the lens of the eye. It's a soft, translucent, skittle-shaped piece that has layers and layers of fibers, almost kind of peels out like an onion too. So it's elasticy, meaning a little bit stretchy, not super rock hard, and it's biconvex. So convex means kind of outward shaped. So it makes that little skittle shape, which is truly termed biconvex, but I like skittle shaped better. And that means it's bulging on both sides. So those layers of fibers are kind of laid out like an onion, different layers. It could peel off, which you can do that if you want to during our dissection. It's a little bit squishy with the elastic fibers, that biconvex shape. And that biconvex shape helps to send the light through because the lens is essentially responsible for near and far vision. So the front surface of the lens is in contact with the liquid of the aqueous humor, because remember, that fluid flows from the ciliary body out the front. Boop. But the back of the lens is actually in contact with the aqueous or the vitreous humor. So aqueous humor in the front, vitreous humor in the back. So it's one of the only pieces of the eye that touches both of those different fluids. All right, remember that. The job of the lens is to help focus a clear image or send the light pieces to those photoreceptors very clearly through something called accommodation, an accommodation process, which is increased or decreased by those ciliary body muscles pulling and pushing and increasing or decreasing that lens concavity, or how biconvex that is, or that specific shape. So the shape is really important. Remember, the shape gets changed. You can see those little stringy muscles from the body of the ciliary body, to be able to change that shape. Another good image for you guys to practice with labeling and kind of understanding it. There is a normal lens that you can see the shape of, light going through the cornea towards the back where the optic nerve is, right? Which is the blind spot. So we remember, we need the light to spread out. Why would we need the light to spread out? Well, we have that retina. You can see the retina stretches that whole back of the eyeball. So the more light that hits, the more amount of photoreceptors on the back of the retina, or in the retina, I guess, is going to be a clearer, more focused image. So you can see that bottom part. Well, it's actually showing a clouded lens that's not having it focused. I have a video. I'm going to have to open up the video and remind you guys to watch that as well. So something else about the retina I wanted to go over, because I talk about it as being the retina is the business end of the eye. So the retina lines most of that vitreous compartment in that posterior chamber, and it has multi-layers. It has a layer of nerve fibers, right? Because we have, it's nervous system related. It has ganglion cells, which is essentially related to the nervous system as well. The bipolar layer and the ganglion cell layer isn't as important to me, except for understanding that's why it's called the nervous layer, because it has these different layers of nerve cells. But then it has that single layer of the photoreceptors as well as the pigment. And I've mentioned before that that pigment is dark to be able to absorb the light so that those photoreceptors can be stimulated. So the optic disc I brought up already, called the blind spot of the eye, because that is where those nerves come together and converge to turn into that optic nerve and leave the eye to go to the brain. Nerves and blood vessels are located here, but no photoreceptors at all. So not only is it just that the nerves are there, but there's no photoreceptors. So there's no visual image physically being formed there at all. Those photoreceptor cells, neurons with dendrites modified to sensory for light, receptors for light, are those rods and cones. So rods are more sensitive to light itself, like observing light, and cones are more sensitive to color and detail. Domestic animals have many, many rods, so they're able to see light very well and see things clearly that way, but not as many cones as other species, especially even humans. So therefore they don't see color as clearly. So that's when people say that dogs are colorblind, and that's not really the case, but color and detail is not able to be formed as well because of the lack of cones. But other things are the sensitivity to light. So the detail, well, not detail, because that's It's hard to explain. So if the photoreceptors have more rods, they're more sensitive to light, they're able to see more or better or increase that sensory information going to the brain, but not color and detail. It doesn't come through because of those lack of cones. I hope that makes sense. So the business end of the eye, where the visual image is formed, is the retina. So I have to make the drawing and put it in Blackboard for you guys because I call it the reverse mullet. So if it's business in the back, party in the front. So there's a lot going on in images and light and switching things around and the process of accommodation happening in the front of the eye. But we get down to business with the retina. So it is business in the back, party in the front. That formation of the visual image, here's just another good one for you. And this is going to be, there's going to be a video to watch from the movie Wild Wild West, where I want you to see a little part of it and you'll see what I'm talking about. It's obviously a fictional movie, but the concept of this is what they're talking about and showing you. Obviously, you can't really turn a head upside down and see the visual image more clearly like they're going to show you on the video, but the concept is still there. So the formation of the eye, you see that light. So the light is let in by way of the cornea, goes through the pupil with that muscular diaphragm of the iris, opening or closing it. And then it's going to be focused by the lens itself, which you see there. But then what happens is the image is actually upside down and backwards on the retina, and it's actually put back together and made upright as we know it in the brain. That's pretty cool. We're going to talk a little bit about extraocular structures, so structures outside of the eye. I have a couple of definitions that I want you to jot down so you can help break down these words. But bulbar, B-U-L-B-A-R, means eyeball. Palpebra, P-A-L-P-E-B-R-A, palpebra or palpebral with an L on the end, means eyelid. The conjunctiva is the thin, moist, transparent membrane, mucous membranes, that covers the front portion of the eyeball. So remember, bulbar would be pertaining to the eye, so conjunctiva of the eyeball. When it lines the interior surface of the eyelids, since palpebra is eyelid, palpebral conjunctiva. Okay, I'm going to use my eyeball again, so don't freak out. But underneath here in my eyelid, so that's eyelid mucous membranes, palpebral conjunctiva. But if you look really close, if I look the other way, you can still see that there's mucous membranes kind of holding that eye in or kind of attached to it. That's that bulbar conjunctiva. Look at your own eyeball in the mirror. Seriously, explore all these different parts and pieces so you understand what I'm talking about. Then try to look at your pets if they'll let you, so you can get this kind of converted to your memory. The conjunctival sac is the space between the bulbar or eyeball and palpebral or eyelid portions of the conjunctiva. So kind of down inside here. So that would be the conjunctival sac, that area between. Eyelids, there's that palpebra or palpebrae, if it's plural. Upper and lower folds of skin. We know what eyelids are. Lined by conjunctiva. Keep them nice and soft and moist to be able to blink and not scratch the eyeball. Blepharitis is inflammation of the eyelid, and blepharospasm is squinting. Now, canthi has to do with the corners of the eye. So the middle or medial would be the inside corner of the eye where the eyelids come together. And lateral is the outside canthi where the eyelids come together. Tarsal glands are also called meibomian glands. This is a really good picture, the one in the middle. So that is essentially an eyelid that looking up along the lining of it. And there's these tiny little dots that you can see, which are meibomian glands or tarsal glands. They're tiny openings on that palpebral margin, margin meaning edge, palpebra meaning eyelid, that produce a waxy substance that prevents tears from overflowing onto the face. How cool is that? Your eye literally has a way of keeping your eye tears in and keeping everything moist and taken care of. Of course it does. They sometimes they can get plugged. That plugged meibomian gland is called a meibomian gland cyst or a chalazion. But most of the time, meibomian gland cysts, we call it sometimes a sty. You probably heard that. And that is essentially like a clogged pimple, but it's specifically in that meibomian gland. So sometimes they'll do a hot pack. Sometimes they can get an overgrowth of that, the hyperplastic overgrowth of that area also. My other note on here, because it says cilia lined. Does it say that on this one? I thought we covered that already. I think we did. But eyelashes are called cilia, and they are more prominent on the upper lid of the animals, of most animals, than they are on the lower lid. You can see that in these pictures as well. That bottom picture, especially with that plugged meibomian gland, you can see those upper eyelashes or cilia, but not lower ones. Continuing on extraocular structures, oh, there you can see that eyelashes are cilia. That's right there, prominent on the upper lids. That was already on there. I forgot I added that. A third eyelid, which is the nictitating membrane or nictitans membrane, is a T-shaped plate of cartilage that is covered by its own conjunctiva. There's no muscle attachment, which is passive movements, which means it's not skeletal. It's not smooth muscle that becomes autonomic. It is passive movements on its own. There's lymph nodes and accessory lacrimal glands or tear glands that are on the bulbar surface, which you know now, that is the eyeball side of things. You can see some of those swollen, popped out through that cartilage area called a cherry eye, and either has to be replaced or removed. The bottom one with the kitty, you can see the third eyelid is up, kind of like raised, and some drugs can do that, and some different situations that can happen also. Extraocular or outside of the eye structures are muscles. They're called extrinsic eye muscles, which are extraocular, and those muscles physically attach to the sclera or that fibrous white of the eye. They're small skeletal muscles because, you know, you can move them on your own. Move your eyeballs right and left, up and down, round in a circle. Ooh, you're making myself dizzy. So those eye muscles, there are 6 extraocular muscles in humans and domestic animals. So 4 straight, you can see that in the picture. So they are on top, on the bottom, on the right, on the left, and 2 obliques, meaning side to side. Some animals have a 7th fun fact called a retractor bulbi. So that's actually a muscle that can pull the eyeball a little bit further back in the socket. Not all animals have that though. So there are a range of motions because of their range of attachments being up, down, left, right, to the side. And so kind of like a joystick can go all these different directions. You can see the names of them on there. Superior, meaning above, rectus. Inferior, meaning below, rectus. Lateral rectus, so that would be the outside of the eye. Medial rectus would be towards the inside or towards the midline. And then an inferior oblique and a superior oblique. So that's all 6 of them. Lacrimal apparatus is the structures that are included in that produce and secrete tears and also drain tears away from the surface of the eye. Lacrimal glands, or glands that produce tears, are the primary source of where tears are made. But then there's also a tear drainage system which gets rid of those tears. So think about the point of tears. If you get dust in your eye and your eyes water and you're blinking and blinking, so it's to flush it, to rinse it, and then drain it, to flush and keep that eye safe and clean. So the lacrimal puncta, lacrimal sacs, and the nasolacrimal duct are the portions of the tear drainage system. So look at the drawing of the face there. So you can see that there is an above lacrimal gland, so where tears are produced, lacrimal ducts, where those are come down into the eyeball, lacrimal puncta, which essentially have a hole or an area that goes from the eye to the system, the drainage system. I can't think of a better word. And that nasal lacrimal gland or duct is a tube that goes all the way. So if you've ever cried, been super sad and your nose gets really runny, that's because you've been super sad. You've produced all these tears and then your body is trying to drain them out and rinse your eye. So it comes out through that nasal lacrimal duct and drains into your nose and drips out. So that's how that works. Tears themselves are a liquid film that is designed to moisten, keep it nice and soft and supple, and protect or rinse the surface of the eye. There are 3 main layers of tears, and these are important. The inner layer is the mucoid layer or a mucus layer. Goblet cells in the conjunctiva itself produce this portion or this layer, and it actually has antibacterial substances. So that's pretty awesome. So it kind of, when it does that rinsing portion, it coats and helps prevent microinvaders by this antibacterial substance in this first layer. The middle layer of tears comes from the lacrimal glands themselves and accessory lacrimal glands of the third eyelid that keeps the cornea moist. So it's supposed to be just a moistening factor, because if eyes are dry, the eyelids start sticking to them. They get really itchy. Those fibrous layers aren't as strong. So the eye can definitely become injured. So that comes from the middle tear layer from the lacrimal glands or tear glands. The outer layer or lipid layer comes from those meibomian glands. I already talked about those meibomian glands that are on the margin of the palpebra or eyelid. And I mentioned that it reduces the tears from falling out. So it's not super watery and just flowing out anyway. It actually kind of holds your tears in, and also reduces evaporation of underlying tear layers. So that way, if you're in a really dry climate, which we are in Arizona, we already have to deal with somewhat of the dryness, just sucking out the low humidity, sucking out some of those eyes. And that's why everyone pretty much has some dry eye. I have severe dry eye. I have KCS, which I think I'm going to talk about in another slide. Here's just another good visual of that lipid layer on the outside to prevent it from evaporating, to prevent it from falling out. And that comes from those meibomian glands. That aqueous layer, and there's a mucus layer and an epithelial layer. So that all kind of is produced there. There's those meibomian glands or tarsal glands of the eye. Lacrimal gland is up underneath the eye here that produces that aqueous layer, and that mucin layer, which has that antibacterial substances. Ooh, gross. So this is KCS, or keratoconjunctivitis sicca, or an autoimmune dry eye, severe dry eye. And I put that real gross picture on there because that is usually how you see them in practice, that they have a lot of eye boogers. Maybe the client's been just wiping them for a while, but really yellow. And what the body is doing is that since the eye is getting so dry and can be injured, it's essentially trying to protect it. It's trying to put a goo Band-Aid over the eyeball so that it doesn't get damaged. So what's the test for this disease as well? If you said Schirmer tear test, you are correct. So a Schirmer tear test, if you're not familiar, is putting a little piece of paper that is the test. So it's not just like a random piece of paper, and you put it in that conjunctival sac and hold it there and rest for 1 minute. And it should be over 15, I think, is that what Cindy teaches you? Because that's what I've always said. So it should be over 15 of the tears that are being produced to kind of get that out of the eye is what the point is. I've seen this eye in this picture, if I had to guess, would be a 0 or 1 millimeter of tear production. So it's been not producing tears for a while. The eye itself is drying out. Anything that touches it, since the fibrous layer of the sclera or even the cornea is so dry and crusty, you'll start to see ulcers or damage or even rupture of the eyeball. So it's pretty serious. I think this is my last one, but I wanted to mention while we're here, so since this is an autoimmune condition, usually a medication, an eye drop called cyclosporine is what is administered to get that tear production to increase. Like I mentioned, Schirmer tear test is important to know about this because it tests the actual tear production of the eye. A lot of times it is recommended to use like liquid eye drops, or I'm totally drawing a blank on what you put in the eye ointment for surgery, that kind of thing, to keep it moistened on its own while that condition is being treated. But doing also then a fluorescein stain to determine if there's any actual disruption or abrasion or break of the fibers of the eye, which then in turn would be described as a corneal abrasion or a corneal ulcer. And that happens a lot. That's pretty common. Ooh, eye contact. All right, I hope you enjoyed that and learned some stuff. I can't wait to dissect eyeballs with you.